Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally. I'm starting a brand new series on Tenable OT Security where we'll have several episodes covering the technical aspects of the tool itself. So that's prerequisites, setting it up, going through the whole entire installation process, pulling out a lot of the experiences that I've learned as far as when it comes to best practices with the tool. We'll talk about some of the publications out there that we have that Tenable's put out, as well as some of the experience I've had on some gotchas as you're deploying, especially if you want to make sure that you have a platform that will grow throughout the process. So we are actually moving into episode 1, and episode 1 is going to be about securing the foundation, really talking about what is Tenable OT Security, why is it important, what is critical infrastructure, and why is there such a big focus on it today, and what does the tool actually bring to us? So jumping in, we're gonna really dive into this world of OT security. We're gonna talk about Tenable OT security and the part that it plays in this world, and we're gonna really talk about laying the foundation or the groundwork for what does Tenable OT security do, what does it provide, why is it crucial to the protection of our critical infrastructure, and what is critical infrastructure to some degree? And what are OT-based systems? What does it mean when we talk about operational technology? We'll talk about how OT stands apart from your traditional IT security systems. And so as we go through, we're going to start laying a foundation for why do we need the type of tools like Tenable OT Security. In this series, I'm going to say that this is going to be perfect for newcomers or seasoned professionals. We're really going to embark on a journey towards securing our critical infrastructure. Tenable OT Security is just one of those tools out there that we're going to focus on, but there's many other ways to do this. All right, so let's start with what is Tenable OT Security. So Tenable OT Security is an appliance, well, I'll say it's an appliance and a sensor that can be deployed out into industrial control systems. We're really looking at those networks to monitor for things like vulnerabilities and cybersecurity network-based events that could potentially be malicious in nature. We can really deploy this hardware either in a virtual way or via hardware that you buy from Tenable. And it's really comprised of two main pieces. You have your main core appliance or one or more sensors that are out there. And before I get too deep into this, we'll talk about what these different components do and why it's important. So let's take a step back and say, what is Tenable OT Security? Well, we know it's an appliance. We've talked about that. We know it can be deployed in industrial control systems or OT networks. But what does it really do? So if you go out to Tenable, there's actually a bunch of data sheets and stuff like that. Let's learn a little bit about what Tenable has to say. So Tenable talks about Tenable OT Security as a way of protecting your industrial networks from cyber threats or malicious insiders or human error. How does it do that? Well, one of the ways that it pulls information is it sits passively on a network and it sniffs that traffic to make sure that there's nothing bad going on. So it captures packets off the network, and it goes through and does analysis on those packets, and it'll tell you, hey, this looks like legitimate traffic, or hey, this looks a little fishy. Can I dig into it a little bit? So Tenable OT does all that analysis and in a very passive manner, just picking up data off the network. But the second thing it does that really sets it apart is it's able to talk to other devices out there like HMIs or control panels or PLCs or RTUs that are out there. And I know there's some terms that I'm using that you may not be aware of. We'll dig into what those are a little bit later. But the important thing to know is we're talking about these low functioning devices that sit out in industrial networks. Tenable OT has the ability to talk to them in their native language. So a lot of times when we're talking over proprietary protocols and stuff like that, the device can talk to it in its own natural language. So we're not doing scans with things like Nessus. We're more talking about how do I communicate across devices from one to the other. There's two main devices here. You have your Tenable OT appliance, which you'll see down in the bottom left of our screen, and you have your Tenable OT configurable sensor. The core appliance is the brains of the operation. It's going to do all that analysis I talked about. It's going to get all that data from the sensor. The sensor is going to push that up from the deepest parts of the network into the appliance. The appliance is then going to crunch the numbers. It's going to say, hey, I'm seeing malicious stuff, or hey, I'm seeing some questionable activities, or hey, I found something with a certain firmware version or model number that has a known vulnerabilities that are associated with it. So Tenable OT is a way of really understanding what's sitting in those industrial control systems from an asset point of view, from an inventory point of view, and from a vulnerability or risk perspective. So why is this important? Well, traditionally, these industrial control systems, we really haven't had any insight whatsoever. Because of when they were built and why we were built them and the way that they're built, a lot of times we don't have a good inventory. We really don't know what things are talking or how they're talking. And that's been okay in the past, but in most recent years, especially over the last 10 years, there's been a big focus on critical infrastructure. Well, what is critical infrastructure? So critical infrastructure is really those systems that we kind of take for granted. We don't think about, but there are things that really illuminate our modern world. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are things like that just provide basic vital health and safety for our culture. So if you think about how do we drive down the road? What are the lighting? What are the sensors that we have for traffic control, right? So if I pull up to a light, a red light or a green light or whatever, what controls that system? How do I know when to turn the light? How do I know what the timing is to make sure that I don't have accidents or traffic jams and those sort of things? That's controlled by an industrial control system. It's also things like power, water, fuel, heating and cooling of our homes or our office buildings, medical devices, defense, rail systems, flight, automobiles, agriculture. Like the list goes on and on and on. We have these control systems that we don't really think about, but they're the things that really bring our world to life. It's the industrial control systems are the systems really that make it so that we have a decent way of life. So let's just take water, for example. Excuse me. If we were to look at water in and of itself, something that we take for granted, but when we go into our kitchens or our bathrooms and we turn the faucet on, water just comes. And we trust it. It's clean water, it's safe to drink. In most cases, it's safe to drink. And it's just there. It's not something we think about. But what if one day when we turn that faucet, the water didn't come on? Now, I'm a big hiker. I love like when I'm not doing this kind of stuff where I'm doing training or I'm talking about critical infrastructure or cybersecurity systems. I love to be in the woods. And I've done these long trips where you don't necessarily have a good water source. And so I'll go out and we'll be hiking and I want to find a stream or a spring or something that can do that, but I can't just drink that water. That water is not safe. So I have to hike in such a way that I know where my water sources are. I have to have a way of filtering that water to make sure that it's safe, and I need a way of carrying or getting it to me. This turns into hours and hours of work when I'm out on the trail. I got to go out there. I get it. I have a filtering system I set up, or I have to boil it to make sure that it's safe. There's a whole process of getting water that we typically don't think about, where when I'm out there, that could take up an hour or two if I'm in a campsite just dealing with water every day. Forget about the regular cooking and all the other things that we have to do. Just the water piece is so much work out there. When we walk back in our home, it's as easy as turning a faucet on. So what if we couldn't trust that? What if in the chemical mixture of water, too much chlorine came through? What would happen? Or too much fluoride? And fluoride is great for us. It's like saved a lot of dental work over the years since we started adding fluoride to the water, but too much and it becomes poisonous. What if that happened to us? Or what if the water didn't work at all? What would happen to our culture? So these are the industrial control systems that we're talking about protecting. And this is things like we've heard stories of automobiles running off the road because they're drive-by-wire now. There's so many things and there's so many reasons why we really want to protect these industrial control systems. So why is this a problem? shouldn't it be easy? Just patch it, right? Well, not necessarily. The tech is typically old in many cases. And when I say old, I mean old. 15, 20 years. It's not what we think about in tech in the IT space. So it's not always possible to fix these problems in traditional ways. It's like sort of saying, how do I fix a tire on my car? Or how do I fix that conveyor belt? It's not quite as easy as just saying, hey, I can go patch it. A lot of times these are firmware. We'll talk a little bit about this further as we move into some of our slides. But because the tech is often old or analog or over serial, there's different ways. It's not always possible to just say, hey, we're going to, patch on every patch release. Even if vendors say, hey, the idea is to upgrade the firmware, that may not be as easy as it sounds on the surface. The next thing is something that's needed is we need to ensure the availability. Now I use the analogy of what about our water? So when we think IT, typically we think of things like, hey, we got to worry about the confidentiality of this information. Well, not so much in this world. In this world, we need to make sure that people get water to their homes and it's safe to drink. So it's about availability and it's about the integrity of whatever that is. So we need to make sure that there are safeguards in place to ensure availability and that people aren't poisoning the water, right? So we need safeguards against those essential services. Cybersecurity staff typically have limited insight into the risk or the inventory of these systems. They don't necessarily know the difference between patching here or updating firmware here and in an IT space. So part of the reason that we're driving forward is we're going to talk about the difference in these systems and how we can run in a more secure environment so that we do know what inventory is out there. We do have insight into these industrial networks and we can better understand the risks that we're facing. So how is this different? How does it differ? How does OT differ from IT? Well, OT is significantly different than IT. So for example, risk priorities. If we've been working in cybersecurity in the IT space, we understand the triad. And if you haven't heard of the triad, what I'm talking about is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So in that world, I'm worried about, is my information safe from being leaked out? Am I making sure that nobody's getting the information that's really my intellectual property or things that could put me at risk? And then is that data, is there integrity to that data? I'm not giving false data or bad data? And then is it availability? And these are typically balanced. But if you look in the OT market, that's not true. Those priorities change significantly. The number one is safety. It's not necessarily the confidentiality of the system. The integrity to some degree is relied to safety, but a lot of times our safety systems are driven by very manual processes like gravity or electricity that's either on or it's off. So it's really the risk priorities is number one is safety, and that means human safety. So how do we protect people from getting hurt in environments? The reliability of those systems are critical, and then the availability. So safety, reliability, and availability become the priorities instead of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it kind of flips this on its head where we say availability has a lot bigger, a lot more important than these other two pieces of a triad. Because with availability, that means that we'll have availability for safety, it'll become reliable, we know that it's always up, and then things like confidentiality become secondary. It's kind of an afterthought. That's great if we get it, but that's not the end of the day when it comes to security. There's more important things than just confidentiality. That doesn't mean they don't care about it. Sometimes there's intellectual property out there they don't want to get out, but then we're talking about IT systems again. Where in OT systems, we're not too worried about the data getting out. The lifespan of the systems are significantly different too. In many cases, we're talking about 20 plus years. So to give you an idea, I was working with a previous vendor that was building a nuclear power plant. To give you an idea, the build of that plant ran 7 years over when their scheduled release or uptime was. Overall, it took over 15 years to build this plant. Brand new plant, it took 15 years to build. If we got into this and we said, okay, we're going to look at this from a lifespan of an IT system based on research that's out there from computer world, we're seeing tech refreshes happen as often as every 3 years on average. If you compare this to a plant that took 15 years, 14 years to build, we would never finish. So when you start looking into these operational technologies, a lot of times manufacturing, power generation, transmission, you think about the things that we take for granted. Water plants, they took years and years and years to build. We can't refresh the technology because it took us 15 years. So it may be another 15 years before the money even comes out of this. So the idea of refreshing all of this is just not an option. So really the way these plants are built is to run to failure. They're meant to run 20, 30, 40 years without really touching them. You have normal maintenance where they're going in and looking at valves and updating like actuators that are out on the plant. But overall, they're really designed to run to failure. So they run much longer than IT systems where we're looking at these shorter life cycles. These shorter life cycles also do something else. It makes it a lot easier to patch. We can just update them. Where sometimes some of these systems, if we update, it means a whole entire rebuild in the OT space, which isn't even really a thought. There's no way I can do this. We've invested millions and millions and millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars in a build. Just doing a refresh and replacing equipment is out of the question because it would mean a whole complete redesign of that plant. When you move into protocols, that's very different too. In this space, most of our protocols from a communications point of view are proprietary in the OT space. And that's good because we understand them. They're vendor-based. Each vendor is using kind of a proprietary protocol that they use. Where in the IT space, most of our protocols are well known based on known standards. HTTPS, SSH, FTP. It doesn't mean that those protocols aren't used in OT as well, but we also have another layer of protocols on top of that that are really specialized for very specific functions and very specific vendors. And a lot of times these specialized protocols or the proprietary protocols are really unfamiliar to our IT professionals. There are things like S7 or Concept or Profibus or Profinet, Foundation Field Bus. I don't know if you've heard any of those, but these are all protocols that are used by different vendors in different environments. So downtime for tolerance typically is a no-no. There's very little tolerance for downtime. So these plants have been built, whether it's manufacturing or whether it's water or whatever that is, it's built to produce X amount of widgets or power or water per minute, per hour, per second. And every minute of downtime either costs problems in society or it causes problems with revenue. So in general, there's very little tolerance for, especially for unscheduled downtime. A lot of these will have scheduled maintenance periods where they come down, like bring a system down once every quarter or once every year, or in some cases once every 3 years. So this idea that we can do a patch or a firmware update and reboot just doesn't exist in the OT space, where that's a lot more tolerable in the IT space. We're used to patching, we're used to reboots. Nobody gets hurt on a reboot of an IT system, where safety systems go down and restarts and firmware upgrades and stuff like that in the OT space. So the idea of this patching and firmware updates just may not be possible without a plant rebuild. That means we need to be creative about remediation. Are there other ways that we can do it? Instead of necessarily removing the vulnerability, are we able to go in and block the pathway instead? How can we make it so that nobody can access that vulnerability? In some cases, we can update the firmware or we can fix things, but for the most part, we have to be very creative about how we do that. And the final thing is lab testing for patches and availability to virtualize in your IT space makes it pretty easy to know that we can safely go into making changes in an IT network. In an OT network, however, it can be very expensive. There's got to be engineering reviews and testing. And we don't necessarily have a lab that we can work in, because you can talk about plants that may cover square miles instead of just having a virtual footprint. So it makes it a lot harder to do that testing and review. So sometimes making a change in the plant for security could take months and months and months to test, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in engineering resources just to make sure that it's not going to break the plant in some way. So what's next? So we've talked a little bit about OT, what it is, what that space looks like, what's critical infrastructure and why is it important. We've done a little bit of introduction to Tenable OT Security and how it fits in. And our next episode, we're going to have a step-by-step guide on installing Tenable OT Security. We're going to talk about prerequisites. We're going to talk about system setup. We're going to talk about how to activate those. So this may be an episode A, B, and C. We'll see how long each one of these are. But in general, I want to keep these videos into around 20, 30 minutes or something like that for each one. If you have any questions or any areas you'd like to cover, put that in the comments below. I'm good about watching those. If you want to follow this, please hit that subscribe button. If you hit the little bell to the side, you'll get notifications every time we release. My schedule, I'm planning on hitting 1 or 2 of these a week, depending on what's possible, maybe even more. But again, like if you have questions, especially now that we're building this, we can actually build that into one of the episodes if you have questions about OT or just the industrial environment in general. Until I talk to you next time, have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video.